Good afternoon and welcome to Tuesday's Lunchtime News. Tony Blair has hosted a Muslim summit at Downing Street this morning, bringing political leaders and Muslim clerics together in a task force to beat terrorism.
Their task, of course, is monumental: how to weed out radical extremists from the Muslim community and prevent a repeat of the atrocities on London just over a week ago.
Well, the Islamic community has widely condemned the bombings, but the reality is that the poison preached by a small minority has spread among pockets of extremists.
The question then, will radicalised Muslims who hold anti-Western views listen to a single word their mainstream community leaders have to say? Here's Penny Marshall with the latest on this morning's meeting.
This meeting with the leaders of British Muslim communities is a crucial start in the government's battle to clamp down on extremist Muslim teaching in Britain. Promising that it won't just be a talking shop, 50 Muslim leaders were called in by the Prime Minister this morning to help regulate the quality of religious teaching in mosques and independent Muslim schools. Mr. Blair made it clear that he needed the help of the Muslim community, not just to condemn extremism, but to help tackle it. The other party leaders had been invited for cross-party support.
But what we need to do is to hear from you as community leaders what it is that we could do in order to help and assist.
The suicide bombings of 7/7 has forced the government and the Muslim community to engage in this sensitive dialogue. Muslim Britain was as shocked by the outrage as everyone else. The government is hopeful that this meeting will be the beginning of a permanent and regular dialogue for the benefit of all. Penny Marshall, ITV News.
OK, well, let's get a reaction to that from our political correspondent Libby Wiener in Downing Street. Libby, what have you heard there in the past few minutes?
Well, the meeting is still going on, a very important meeting, symbolically at least, because the Prime Minister has invited all these leaders from the Muslim communities here to try and tackle this problem of extremism within the Muslim community. Now, the people he's invited, though, do amount to what one might describe as the Muslim establishment in this country. Some 5 members of the House of Lords, 4 MPs. Many of the others are academics and consultants. There is one imam too. But I think the question is, can these people, although they're very sympathetic to the Prime Minister's request to look at how to deal with extremism within the Muslim community, can they themselves actually reach out to those elements who are so disenchanted, so disillusioned, that they are prepared to resort to violence?
And Libby, what about the planned visit next month, indeed on the 7th of August, exactly a month after the London bombings, of this Egyptian-born cleric Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who has in fact praised suicide bombers in the past?
Well, it's very unclear whether this invitation is going to be extended to him or not. It is unclear this morning what exactly he has been asked to do. But nevertheless, I think it highlights the dilemma for the government and the authorities in this country as to what to do about people preaching such hatred and how to square that with Britain's long tradition of freedom of speech and hospitality to strangers. I think it highlights exactly the dilemma that the government is going to face in the next few months as to how far it should restrict civil liberties in this country, how far it should restrict people coming to this country because of the dangers of terrorism.
Libby Wiener, thank you very much. Well, the Muslim leaders at Downing Street do have some sway, but it's not clear if they have enough influence to kill off that radical strand of Islam in British communities that turns young men into suicide bombers.
Well, Shahid Malik is the MP for Dewsbury. The ringleader of the London bombers came from his constituency. Here's his personal view on how to root out the extremists.
My name's Shahid Malik. I'm the Member of Parliament for Dewsbury. One of the suspected suicide bombers lived in my constituency. The other 2 lived in Beeston, very nearby. The whole constituency has been shocked and horrified by the events as they've unfolded. I think there's something we can do about it, and I'm going to talk through what I think that is. 2 minutes from the town centre is the main mosque in the town centre. I'm joined by Maulana Abdul Rashid Rabbani Sahab, who has been the Imam here for 30 years and is a respected figure within the Muslim community nationally. Now, these people that killed themselves thought they were going to heaven, and it's my belief that mosques have got to lead the fight. What do you say to that?
If anybody kill himself, he's not going in heaven, and if anybody kill other people, he's not going in heaven. There must be a punishment from God, is very strongly.
So one part of the solution is imams taking a very hard line against extremism within the mosque. The other part of the solution is in the home and with the family. Naseem and Akram, tell me, what can you do to ensure that these beautiful kids grow up to be beautiful adults?
Well, what we normally do between us is if the children say anything or they say what's happening, you know, why is so-and-so happening, we're open about it, we talk to the children. And if they say something that's out of line, we'll stop them. We don't just say shut up and be quiet. We explain to them that it's wrong, you don't do that. As humans, we're not meant to do that. And that's not what Islam is about.
I think the most important thing in this country at this moment in time is for people to integrate different colours, different religions, different backgrounds. Only then can we create understanding, eradicate fear and hatred.
It's the only way the world's going to move on. They've got to understand each other and respect each other's ways of life.
Well, I think we should all pull together in times like this and try and eradicate these, what are the fanatics, aren't they?
I think it's very, very important to integrate, obviously, together, and we have to understand each other's way of life.
So these are some of the solutions. Imams taking responsibility in their mosques, parents taking responsibility in the home, young people integrating. It isn't rocket science, it's achievable. And if we can achieve it, then these younger generations will have harmony and safety for many, many decades to come.
The MP Shahid Malik there with his own views on beating terrorism.
Now, of course, nowhere are suicide bombings more common than in Iraq. Every day they drive up an already terrible death toll. Today, researchers have tried to calculate that carnage by estimating the number of civilians killed there since the war began.
Well, as the bombings grow in number and dozens die every day, a research website now estimates the death toll to have reached almost 26,000.
But it's not just the insurgency. Many of those deaths were caused by Allied bombs. Emily Rubin reports now on the deadly destruction.
In Iraq today, the simple task of going to work is often a gamble with death. Still shocked, these men escaped with their lives after a bus taking them to work on an American base was attacked by gunmen. 13 others died. Today, for the first time, researchers for the Iraq Body Count website have estimated that 26,000 civilians have died since the war began. But the majority, 2/3, were killed by insurgents after Saddam Hussein was defeated. And this week alone has been one of the deadliest. Last Wednesday, 27 children were killed by a suicide bomber as they collected sweets from American soldiers. On Saturday, 98 people died when a suicide bomber blew up a fuel truck. 4 policemen were also killed when a bomber targeted a security convoy in Baghdad. Among Sunday's attacks, 6 people died in this suicide bombing near the capital, one of 17 separate attacks carried out over the weekend. It's now estimated that around 50 people are being killed in Iraq every day, the same number who died in London's bombs. Hanzi Lazim knows the horrors only too well. An Iraqi, he's lived in Britain for 40 years. But now, whenever he rings home, he hears of another relative who's died.
Quite frankly, every time there's a bomb that goes, my heart goes sink between my legs. Where immediately I go and phone somebody, or they might phone me, because they know I'll be worried.
We made a lot of promises when we went into Iraq. I'm not sure that the government could have got a majority in the House of Commons if, on the night of that vote, they had actually spelled out to the House of Commons the kind of mayhem and chaos and bloodshed we would be witnessing in Iraq 2 years later.
And this was how it started, a US bombardment called shock and awe. Today's figures say 8,000 civilians lost their lives here and in the rest of the US-led military campaign. But concern will now focus on the country's lawlessness, which continues to claim ever more lives. Emily Rubin, ITV News.
The government's immigration policy was exposed as a shambles today amid accusations that its targets for evicting failed asylum seekers will not be reached without a radical rethink.
Well, a report by the National Audit Office, which monitors government departments, found that in the 10 years between 1994 and 2004, 363,000 asylum applications were rejected.
Over that same period, around 80,000 failed asylum seekers were sent back home, but that's just 1 in 5 of those who came.
Of course, that means that over 280,000 are still here today. Well, Keir Simmons has been to an immigration removal centre in Dover.
Well, this former fort is the centre in Dover where they hold failed asylum seekers before they temporarily release them into the country or deport them. Today's report says all of this is costing the government £600 million per year. Well, Ben Barno is from the Kent Refugee Action Network. The system is failing, isn't it, if people aren't being deported when they've been told they have to leave?
We don't think that's right. And in our view, the important thing is that if we have to have such a system, it's important to make sure it is done properly so that we can avoid injustices. And we are really concerned, for example, about forced deportations to places like Zimbabwe, simply because the government feel they have to meet targets.
Don't you have to have forced deportations, even though this report says they're expensive, though, because at the moment more people are failing the asylum seeker test than are being removed?
Well, let's not forget the human cost of our forced deportation system, because what it means in effect is that people are often woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning, children who are at school are taken out of school and sometimes taken straight into detention or taken onto planes. We think that's inhumane.
Are you worried that with the recent concerns over terrorism that this issue will be even more politicised than it is already?
Well, we say don't play politics with asylum seekers. And what we need to remember is that asylum seekers are more often than not the victims of terrorism than ever they would be the perpetrators.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much. Well, the government has pointed out today that it is spending more money. It says it's released a 5-year plan in February, setting out what it plans to do to solve this problem.
Keir Simmons in Dover there. Now, the press won't pay for the drugs that could help improve their lives.
Well, for today's Life Matters, we're looking at that controversial decision and what it will mean for the million elderly people suffering from dementia in Britain. Our medical editor, Lawrence McGinty, went to meet one of those families whose lives has been changed by the drugs.
Amelia Holworth has been caring for her mother Celia, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 8 years ago. Celia takes 2 drugs which have dramatically changed her life. She can read magazines, she can feed and dress herself, and she's happy. Without the drugs, at £2.50 a day, Amelia is certain Celia would have to be in a care home.
It really has given her quality of life. She will be able to stay on the treatments because she's already been prescribed it, but for anybody who's been recently diagnosed, it's almost like they're saying that they're not worth £2.50 a day. Their quality of life isn't worth £2.50 a day.
The things it affects most are the things you can't measure. It's the things like getting up, helping her to get dressed, helping her to eat, just her being able to lead a normal life. You can't measure that in a survey.
Well, our medical editor, Lawrence McGinty, is here to discuss all of that. Lawrence, a very moving story there, but what are the grounds for this decision?
Well, basically, the government's advisors, this committee called NICE, have looked at the cost-effectiveness of these drugs and said they're not cost-effective. They released this decision earlier on this year. The government, in the shape of John Reid, then the Health Secretary, told them to go away and think again. They've gone away and thought again, and they're saying basically the same thing. They don't have the bottle, however, to withdraw them, so what they've said is, we'll take more evidence. What this decision has provoked is that all the charity groups involved here, the Alzheimer's Society plus the professional institutes, have formed an unprecedented alliance to protect people like Celia and make sure that they still continue to get the drugs. She will, because she's already prescribed them, but new patients might not be in future.
Well, what do new patients do then? I mean, they're clearly helpful.
Well, they clearly work. I mean, I was struck spending an hour with that family. I mean, Celia is in fairly advanced stage. She's been diagnosed for 8 years, but she's happy. She's happy. She's with her family. How can you measure that? How can you put that into one of these economic calculations of cost effectiveness? You just can't do that. There are no other alternative drugs. Some of the ones that are used for treating symptoms are in themselves have side effects. Without these drugs, these people are, I think in many cases, just going to end up in care homes at greater expense to their families and eventually to the state.
OK, Lawrence, I think this is something we're going to hear more about. Thank you very much. Well, staying with health, the Chief Medical Officer for England, Professor Sir Liam Donaldson, said today that smoking is the biggest challenge facing the NHS. He blamed cheap cigarettes, which are smuggled into the country, for costing lives and millions of pounds. He says the only way to beat smoking-related illnesses is to clamp down on tobacco smuggling.
Now, what do you make of that? Is the Chief Medical Officer right? Is smoking really the biggest problem facing us and the NHS?
Or would you say the decision to ration medicine, as we've just heard, for people with Alzheimer's or other illnesses, is that the biggest challenge for patients?
Well, you can have your say on today's Pulse. We'll put your questions directly to Professor Sir Liam Donaldson.
Are you fed up with the NHS waiting lists, poor hygiene in hospitals? Whatever your criticism, please get in.
A revenge now on BBC One when the diagnosis is...
A political commentator who speaks on Hezbollah's behalf warned there would be more to come.
Before yesterday, nobody could have imagined that Hezbollah could target an Israeli warship and destroy it, hit it, damage it, the way you put it. I believe tomorrow we will have the same story repeated and repeated with the new surprises that Hezbollah is providing to the community and to the Israelis.
The Lebanese economy is paying a heavy price. These men went back to their shuttered hairdressing business to discover the worst. A bomb exploding nearby had destroyed it. It's a story that's been repeated across the city. The price in human suffering is rising too. Each attack brings a new stream of injured to the hospitals here. The international community is calling for restraint. So far, such appeals have fallen on deaf ears.
And Tim, what's happening in Beirut tonight?
Well, the latest news is that the Israelis have started to attack the ports here. We had a helicopter gunship flying very close to us a few minutes ago, attacking one port which is just up the road, and the main port of Junia, which is just up the coast over there, was also hit by the Israelis. That adds to their destruction, or their effective destruction, of the international airport, certainly the runways there, most of the main roads here, nearly all the bridges, and now, as I say, the ports are being taken out. Meanwhile, the bombardment of southern Beirut is continuing.